The trio family very much and suffering their loss. Any additions to the petition side that we need to review this time?
There's a praise from Bill Meyer.
Yeah, right, Bill. Visiting Bill in the hospital, of course, last weekend, Mary once again thought this was it. And visiting with him up and bright-eyed in Bishopsfield on Monday afternoon after he just left he wanted to get up and get going again. And in the last 18 months, we've seen him revive 13 times. Yeah. Yeah, so he just can't keep a good guy down, I guess, huh? On the petition side, I'd like to add my sister-in-law, Gina Fern. She's had all kinds of complications from her last chemotherapy treatment and has an infection in her lungs and on a respirator right now. So we want to remember Gina. All right. So we'll put Bill over to the praise side. Remember those folks during our special prayers. All right. Do you have any little ones here this morning? I see no little. Oh, there's somebody. You want to hear a story this morning? Okay. If it's just one, Jesus would still tell the story.
There's only got one. What happened to your other foot? Did you hurt it, or are you just hopping because you feel like hopping? Well, I wanted to tell you about two guys, okay? Two completely different guys, and we want to see if we can figure out what made them different. Why were they different? The first one, his name is Saul. Now, Saul was picked by Samuel to be the king of Israel. And Saul was a very tall man. He was about 6'4". He stood a head above most everybody else. And he believed in God, and he was a follower of God. And he believed that God should lead his people. And so Saul decided that he was going to raise up an army, and they got an army together. And he was going to go into battle against their enemies because God would give them the victory. Well, God's messenger was Samuel. And Samuel said one thing. He said, I want to be there to give the sacrifice before you go. And Saul, he got his men together, and there they were. And they were waiting at the right place at the right time, but there was no Samuel. And they kept waiting. And the men began to get impatient. And Saul began to get worried. He was worried that if the men got impatient enough, that they would go home. Because you know how hard it is to raise an army? These aren't professional soldiers. These are guys that live out in their houses, and they raise crops, and they tend sheep, and they take care of their families, and they can't afford to be out on military campaigns for months on end. And so they were sitting there starting to complain. And Saul was getting really impatient. And you know what Saul did? He finally said, enough of this. I'm going to give the sacrifice myself. And so he did it. And just as they were finishing the sacrifice, here comes Samuel. And Samuel's upset. Oh, Saul, you're supposed to wait for God. You're supposed to wait. And Saul had to wait. Well, there's another incident. Later on, Saul was going to go to battle again. He went out against his enemies, and Samuel had given him very specific instructions. He said, I want you to kill everything. No, don't leave anything behind. No men, no women, no children, no animals, nothing. And so Saul went and did. They went and won the battle, but you know what they did? They kept all the animals. And they brought them back, and they offered sacrifices for the animals to God. And Samuel was upset again. You didn't follow God's instructions. Now there's another guy. His name is David. You know David? Have you heard that name before? Probably have some friends named David, huh? David was a little kid when the story begins. And David was one of 7. He had 6 brothers. But David was the youngest of them, and David was the one put in charge of watching the sheep a lot of times. And he would compose music and things while he was out there. But David trusted in God. He trusted in God so much that he didn't have any fear when it came to confronting the things that were dangerous. For example, one time there was a bear that was going to get at a sheep. You know how big a bear is? Could you tackle a bear? David didn't have any fear about the bear. Most little boys would have run off and would have gone and get some help, right? If you see a bear wanting to get some of your sheep, but David just picked up his sling and killed the bear with his sling. Now, David probably practiced a lot with his sling, but even then, that was a very, very brave thing to do. Later on, he did the same thing with a lion. And then, of course, you've probably heard the story where David is called by his father, and he says, I want you to go down. And Saul had gotten all the armies together again, and they were camped, and they were fighting against the Philistines. I want you to go and bring all this food, and I want you to go find your brothers and find out what's going on. And David gets there. He gets to the valley, and there in this valley where the two armies are set against each other, there's this big man. You know how big he was? 9 feet tall. Can you imagine that? 9 feet tall. See that door over there? That's not even 7 feet tall. So 9 feet tall, you're talking about a man who would stand about 2.5 feet higher than that doorway. That's a big, big man. He'd probably be able to stand up and bump his head against the clock in the back, huh? It's a big guy. Do you think David was afraid? Not at all. You know why? He trusted God. And he knew that Saul was on the wrong side, and Saul was making fun of God. And David says, well, why isn't anyone fighting this guy? Because Saul was saying, come out and fight me, and none of the Israelites would go. And David, of course, eventually went. And did David win? Yeah. And David, did he claim the victory himself? No, he said God did it. God is with me, and today I'm going to kill you because God is with me. Isn't that something? So what was the difference between Saul and David? Did Saul love God? I think Saul loved God. I think he was very sincere. But when it came right down to it, when it got to the point where Saul was scared, what did Saul do? Did he trust God when he was scared? No, he didn't. Saul didn't, did he? Did David trust God when he was scared? Absolutely. Absolutely. It's kind of a sad story for Saul, because Saul eventually died, and David became king eventually, but that's the difference. When we become scared, what do we need to do? We need to trust in God that He's going to take care of us, no matter what you might feel like. Let's go down prayer. Lord, help us to be brave like David was. Help us to trust that You're going to do what You said You would do. And Lord, be with us now as we go about the Sabbath. May we worship You, and may we get to know You even more. We pray this in Your name.